My name is Claire Mitchell. For most of my life, I believe my family had one place that would always belong to all of us. A small cottage by the lake. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't worth millions, but to me, that cottage meant more than money ever could. It was the place where my parents brought us every summer when we were children. The place where my sister and I learned how to swim. The place where my father taught us how to fish before sunrise. The place where my mother baked blueberry pies and complained that we were tracking mud across the wooden floors for years. That little cottage represented one thing. Family. At least that was what I thought. I was 38 years old when everything changed. My younger sister, Emily, was 34. Growing up, people always described us as completely different. They said I was responsible, quiet, practical, the one who thought before making decisions. Emily was the opposite. She was charming, outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. My parents always said Emily had a special personality. She has a way of making people love her, my mother would say, and I never disagreed. Emily was my sister. I loved her, but sometimes I wondered if my parents loved her more. The difference between us started when we were young. It was never obvious enough for anyone else to notice. Nobody said, "We love Emily more." Nobody admitted, "Claire, you are second." But children notice things adults think they hide. They notice whose achievements are celebrated louder. They notice whose mistakes are forgiven faster. They notice who gets the benefit of the doubt. When I got straight A's in school, my parents smiled and said, "That's wonderful, Claire. Keep working hard." When Emily got average grades but joined a school event, my mother would tell everyone, "Emily is such a natural leader." When I won an academic award, we had a quiet dinner at home. When Emily performed in a school play, my parents invited relatives to watch. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself every family was like this, and maybe that was true, but over time, those small moments started adding up. As we got older, the differences became harder to ignore. I went to college, worked part-time, and paid most of my own expenses. I learned independence early. Emily took a different path. She changed majors twice. She moved home after graduation. She started several projects that never worked out, but my parents always supported her. "She just needs time," my father would say. "She has so much potential," my mother would add, and I wanted to believe they saw potential in me too, but most of the time, I felt like I was the person they trusted, not the person they celebrated. There was a difference. A big one. After college, I built a stable career. I worked in business management. I bought my own house. I paid my bills. I rarely asked my parents for help. In fact, I became the person they asked for help. When my mother needed someone to drive her to appointments, she called me. When my father needed help organizing documents, he called me. When Emily had financial problems, somehow I was always the person who heard about it, and I helped, because that was who I was. I believed family meant showing up, even when nobody noticed, even when nobody thanked me. The cottage was always the one thing I thought would be different. My parents bought it when I was 12. They couldn't afford anything luxurious. The roof leaked sometimes. The kitchen was outdated. The furniture was old, but every summer we went there. No matter how busy life became, the cottage brought us back together. When I was a teenager, I would sit on the dock at night and imagine my future. I imagined bringing my own children there one day. I imagined my parents growing old there. I imagined that place staying in the family forever. My father used to say, "One day, this cottage will belong to you girls." That sentence stayed with me. I never forgot it. Years passed, life changed. My parents got older, the cottage became harder for them to maintain. Emily got married. I remained single, not because I couldn't find someone, because I spent many years focused on building my career and taking care of responsibilities. My family always joked, "Claire doesn't need anyone. She can handle everything." Everyone laughed, but nobody realized that being the strong one could become lonely. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Friday night. My mother called me earlier that week. "Claire, we're having a family dinner this Friday," she said. Her voice sounded excited. "We have something important to announce." I immediately thought about the cottage. Maybe they finally wanted to discuss the future. Maybe they wanted to talk about repairs. Maybe they wanted to create a plan together. I remember feeling strangely happy, because a small part of me still wanted to believe that my parents saw me as an equal. When I arrived at my parents' house, everything looked normal. My mother had prepared my favorite meal. My father was sitting in his usual chair. Emily and her husband were already there. Everyone seemed relaxed, almost too relaxed. During dinner, we talked about ordinary things: work, weather, family news. Then, after dessert, my father put down his coffee cup. "I think it's time we talk about the cottage." My heart immediately lifted. I Smiled, finally, the conversation I had expected for years. My father looked around the table, then he said, "Your mother and I have made a decision." I nodded. "We're passing the cottage to Emily." For a second, I thought I heard him. Wrong, the room became strangely quiet. I looked at my mother, she didn't look surprised, she already knew. I looked at Emily, she looked uncomfortable but not shocked, which meant one thing: they had already discussed this, without me. I forced myself to smile. "Emily?" My father nodded, "Yes. We think it makes the most sense." I waited for someone to explain, nobody did. Then my mother said, "Emily has children now. She needs a place where the family can gather." I looked down at my plate. I didn't know what to say, because suddenly, every memory I had connected to that cottage felt different. All those summers, all those family moments, all those promises, they were apparently never mine. I finally asked, "Did you two ever consider asking me what I thought?" My father looked confused. "Claire, don't make this difficult." That sentence hurt more than the decision itself, because it showed me something. They weren't worried about hurting me, they were worried about my reaction. My mother reached across the table. "We know you're independent. You have your own life." There it was, the same thing I had heard my entire life: because I was responsible. They assumed I needed nothing, because I was strong. They assumed I never got hurt. Then Emily spoke. "Claire, I hope you're not upset." I looked at my sister, she sounded sincere, but sincerity didn't change the situation. I asked, "Did you know before tonight?" She hesitated, just for a moment, but that moment told me everything. "Yes," she whispered. I felt something inside me break, not because Emily got the cottage, not because of the property, but because everyone I loved had been having conversations about my family's future. And I wasn't part of them. I stayed for another 20 minutes. I smiled. I answered questions. I pretended everything was fine, because that was what I always did. I made everyone comfortable, even when I was the one hurting. But when I walked outside and got into my car, I sat there in silence. I looked back at my parents' house, the place where I had spent my entire life trying to belong, and for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never wanted to ask: was I really part of this family? Or was I just the person they knew would always be there? That night, I didn't call my parents. I didn't argue. I didn't demand anything, but I made a decision. A decision that would change my relationship with my family forever, because sometimes, the moment you realize you are never being chosen is the moment you finally stop waiting to be. The days after that dinner felt different, not because anything dramatic happened. There were no angry phone calls. No arguments. No family members accusing each other, and somehow, that made it hurt even more, because silence can reveal things that words cannot. I kept waiting for someone to reach out. Maybe my mother would call and say, "Claire, we've been thinking about what happened." Maybe my father would admit, "We should have talked to you first." Maybe Emily would send a message saying, "I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much this would hurt you." But my phone stayed quiet, and slowly, I started understanding something painful. The cottage wasn't the real loss. The real loss was realizing how easily my family could make a decision about my place in their lives without even asking if I wanted to be included. For the first few days, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I told myself, "It's just a property. It doesn't define my relationship with my family. They probably didn't mean to hurt me." And maybe part of that was true. The cottage was just a building. A roof. A few rooms. A piece of land beside a lake. But emotions are rarely about the object itself, they are about what that object represents. For me, that cottage represented every summer I spent with my family, every birthday, every holiday, every moment when I believed we were connected. It represented a promise my father made when I was a child, and when they gave it away without even talking to me, it felt like they were giving away a part of my history. A week later, I visited my parents, not because I wanted to confront them, not because I wanted to fight. I just wanted to understand. I wanted to know why. My mother opened the door and immediately smiled. "Claire, come in. I was just making coffee." She acted like nothing had happened. That was the strange part. She didn't seem uncomfortable, she didn't seem guilty, she simply continued with life. I followed her into the kitchen. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things, the weather, neighbors. A new restaurant she wanted to try. Finally, I decided to ask, "Mom, can I ask you something about the cottage?" Her expression changed slightly. "Not much, but enough. I knew you'd bring that up." That sentence surprised me, not because she expected the conversation, because of the way she said it, almost like my feelings were an inconvenience. "I just want to understand," I said. "Why wasn't I included in that conversation?" My mother sighed. "Claire, your father and I didn't want to create drama." I stared at her. "Drama?" "Yes. We knew you would have questions." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Questions? I wasn't asking because I wanted something. I was asking because I was part of the family. Or at least I thought I was. My mother sat down across from me. Claire, you have always been independent. I already knew where this was going. You have a good job. You have your own house. You don't have children. She paused. Emily has a family. She needs stability. And there it was, the explanation everyone seemed to accept. Emily needed more. Claire could handle less. I had heard different versions of that sentence my entire life. Emily needed help because she was struggling. Emily needed support because she was young. Emily needed understanding because life was complicated, but somehow nobody ever asked what Claire needed. I looked at my mother. Do you know how many times I helped Emily? She looked confused. What do you mean? I helped her pay bills when she was between jobs. Silence. I helped her move when she couldn't afford movers. More silence. I spent weekends helping her prepare for interviews. My mother looked uncomfortable because maybe she didn't know. Or maybe she knew and had forgotten. Either way, the result was the same. My sacrifices disappeared because I never complained. That was something I finally understood. People often assume the person who gives the most needs the least. The person who always says yes becomes the person nobody worries about because they believe she'll be fine. But being fine and being valued are two completely different things. I had spent years being fine. I had been fine when my achievements were overlooked, fine when my brother received more attention, fine when my sister needed help, fine when my own feelings were pushed aside, but I wasn't fine. I was tired. When I left my parents' house that afternoon, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt clear, because for years I had been trying to convince myself that the favoritism wasn't real. I kept finding excuses. They're just different with Emily. They don't mean anything by it. They're getting older. But the truth was simple. They had made a choice, and that choice showed me exactly where I stood. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I received a message from Emily. At first, I didn't want to open it. Part of me was still hurt, but eventually I clicked. It said, Claire, I hope you're not angry. I know the cottage means a lot to you, but Mom and Dad thought it was the right decision. I read it several times, not because I was surprised, because I noticed something. She didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't say, I understand why this hurt. She said, they thought it was the right decision. As if she was simply passing along their choice. As if none of them had actually made a decision that affected me. That night, I sat in my living room and looked around my own house. A house I bought myself. A place nobody gave me. A place I earned, and suddenly I saw something I had ignored for years. I had spent so much energy trying to prove I belonged in my family that I had forgotten I had already built a life where I belonged. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for the cottage. I wasn't going to compete with my sister. I wasn't going to beg my parents to see my value, because love that has to be begged for doesn't feel like love. From that day forward, I stopped chasing the place they refused to give me, and I started focusing on the one thing I could control. My own future. What I didn't know at the time was that walking away from the cottage would create a chain reaction, because while my family thought they had given Emily a gift, they didn't realize what they had taken away. They didn't realize how many responsibilities had quietly been carried by me, and when I finally stepped back, everyone would discover just how much I had been holding together. The first thing I did after making that decision was simple. I stopped volunteering. For years, I had been the person who stepped forward before anyone asked. If my parents needed help organizing paperwork, I was there. If my mother needed someone to drive her somewhere, I adjusted my schedule. If my father needed advice about a decision, he called me. If Emily had a problem, somehow my name was always the first solution. I never thought of it as a burden. I thought it was love. But after the cottage situation, I finally started seeing the difference between being loved and being useful. The change didn't happen overnight. I didn't wake up one morning and suddenly stop caring about my family. That would have been impossible. They were still my parents. Emily was still my sister. I still remembered all the good moments, the summers at the lake, the family dinners, the holidays, the laughter. The memories were real, but so was the pain, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that both things could exist together. I could love my family and still admit that they had hurt me. A few weeks after the dinner, my mother called. I saw her name appear on my phone while I was at work. For a moment, I felt the old instinct, the instinct to answer immediately, the instinct to make myself available. That was how I had lived my entire life. Someone needed me. I responded, but this time, I looked at the screen and waited, not to punish her, not to make a point, just to ask myself a question. Do I actually want to answer right now? And that was a question I had never asked before. The answer was no. So I let the call go to voicemail. A few minutes later, she left a message. Claire? It's Mom. I need to ask you something. That sentence alone would have been enough in the past. I would have immediately called back, because whenever my family said they needed something, I dropped everything, but now I waited after work. I listened to the voicemail. My mother needed help organizing some documents related to the cottage transfer. The cottage, the same cottage they had decided to give away without including me. I stared at my phone, and for the first time, I realized something. They still expected my help with the things connected to a decision that hurt me. They wanted my support. Without acknowledging my feelings, I called her back. Hi, Mom. Claire. I was wondering if you could help us with some paperwork. I took a breath. Mom. I don't think I'm the right person to help with that. There was silence. A long silence. What do you mean? I mean, Emily is the person receiving the cottage. Maybe she should handle those things. My mother sounded surprised. But you're so good at this. There it was again. Not, we need you. Because we miss you. Not, we need your opinion. Because you matter. Just, you're good at this. I closed my eyes because I finally understood. My skills had always been appreciated, but my feelings had not. I'm sorry, Mom, I said, but I need some space. She didn't argue, she didn't apologize, she just said, okay. But I could hear disappointment in her voice, and strangely, I didn't feel guilty. That was new for years. Guilt had controlled me. If someone was upset, I assumed I had done something wrong. If someone needed help, I felt responsible, but setting a boundary was not cruelty. It was simply acknowledging that I mattered too. Around the same time, I started making changes in my own life, small changes at first. I started taking weekends for myself. I traveled more. I reconnected with old friends. I joined a professional group I had always wanted to join. I started doing things that had nothing to do with being someone's daughter or sister, and slowly, I began discovering a version of myself I had forgotten existed. One evening, I met my friend Rachel for dinner. We had known each other since college. She was one of the few people who had always seen through my everything is fine attitude. After we ordered, she looked at me and smiled. You seem different. I laughed. Different good or different bad? Different free. That word stayed with me, free. I had never thought of myself as trapped, but maybe I had been, not physically, emotionally. I had spent years living according to expectations. Be the responsible daughter. Be the helpful sister. Be the person who never causes problems, and somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I wanted. A few months later, I received another message from Emily. This time, it wasn't about the cottage. It was about a problem. She and her husband were having difficulties managing some financial issues. She wrote, Claire, I don't know who else to ask. I stared at that sentence. The old version of me would have immediately offered help. I would have asked, how much do you need? What can I do? Where should I start? But the new version of me paused, because I finally understood something. Helping someone repeatedly avoid consequences is not always kindness, sometimes it prevents them from learning. I replied, I'm sorry you're going through this. I hope you're able to figure it out. It was the hardest message I had ever written, not because it was mean, because it was different. For the first time, I wasn't saving everyone. I wasn't fixing everything. I wasn't stepping into a role nobody officially gave me. I was letting other adults handle their own lives. A few days later, my father called. His voice sounded unusual, quiet, careful. Claire, your mother tells me you've been busy. Yes, I said, I have. He paused, then he asked, are you upset with us? That question surprised me, because for the first time, someone in my family was finally acknowledging that something had changed. I looked out my window. The life I had built, the life that existed beyond my family's approval, and I answered honestly, I'm not upset, Dad. A pause. I'm just tired of feeling like I'm only needed when someone needs something from me. My father didn't respond immediately, and maybe that was the first time he truly heard me, not as the daughter who would always forgive, not as the person who would always help, but as a person with feelings of her own. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace, because I finally understood that I didn't have to fight for a place at the table. I could build my own table, and people who truly valued me would choose to sit there. But while I was moving forward, my family was beginning to realize something. The person they thought would always be available was no longer waiting by the phone, and without me quietly holding everything together, things inside my family were starting to fall apart. For the first time in my life, I stopped measuring my success by whether my family noticed it. That change was small at first, almost invisible, but it changed everything. I stopped looking back at the house where I grew up, wondering if my parents would ever understand me. I stopped replaying the dinner conversation about the cottage. I stopped asking why Emily was always the one who received more, because I finally realized something important. I couldn't spend my entire life waiting for someone else to recognize my worth. I had to recognize it myself. After stepping away from my family responsibilities, I had more time than I knew what to do with. At first, that felt strange for years. My schedule had been controlled by everyone else. A doctor's appointment for my mother. A problem at my father's office. A last-minute request from Emily. My life had always been full, but somehow, it had never really felt like mine. Now, I had empty weekends, quiet evenings, time to think, and instead of feeling lonely, I started feeling free. I decided to invest that time into my career. I had always been good at what I did, but I had never allowed myself to dream bigger. I was always the person behind the scenes, the person organizing, the person supporting, the person making sure other people succeeded, but I had never asked myself, what if I was the one building something? So I started working on an idea I had carried for years. A business consulting company, nothing huge, nothing unrealistic, just a service helping small businesses improve their operations, manage growth, and solve problems. It was something I understood because I had spent years watching businesses operate, especially my father's company. Ironically, the place where I once felt invisible had taught me valuable lessons. I had been paying attention, even when nobody noticed. The beginning was harder than I expected. People often imagine starting a business as exciting. They imagine confidence, freedom, success, but they don't always see the uncertainty. There were nights when I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by notes and documents. I questioned everything. Was I too old to start over? Was I taking an unnecessary risk? Should I have stayed comfortable? Those doubts came often, but every time I felt afraid, I reminded myself of something. I had already survived the pain of feeling unwanted by the people closest to me. Building something new couldn't hurt more than that. A few months later, my first major opportunity arrived. A small company hired me to help reorganize their business structure. At first, I thought it would be a simple project, but after working with them, they saw the results. Their efficiency improved, their costs decreased, their team became stronger, and they recommended me to another company, then another. Slowly, my name started spreading, not because of my family, not because of my father, not because of who I was related to, because of what I could do. That feeling was completely different. Around that time, something interesting happened. I ran into an old family friend at a business event. Her name was Margaret. She had known my family for years. When she saw me, she looked surprised. "Claire? Is that you?" I smiled. "Yes. It's been a while." She looked at my name badge, then looked at me again. "I heard you started your own company." I nodded. She smiled. "That's amazing. Your father must be so proud." I paused, because years ago, that sentence would have meant everything, but now, I simply said, "I'm proud of myself." The words came naturally, and after I said them, I realized how much I had changed. Meanwhile, things at home were becoming complicated. The cottage that my parents had given to Emily was turning out to be more responsibility than she expected. At first, everyone was excited. Emily posted pictures online, she talked about family vacations, she described it as a dream come true, and I didn't blame her. For her, the cottage represented something wonderful. A gift. A new chapter, but owning a property was different from visiting one. The repairs didn't disappear, the maintenance didn't disappear, the bills didn't disappear, and slowly, reality started catching up. The first problem was the roof. A storm damaged part of it. Emily called my father because she didn't know what to do. Then came issues with the plumbing, then problems with the old heating system. The cottage that everyone imagined as a peaceful family escape became a constant responsibility, and for the first time, my parents realized something. The reason the cottage had always seemed easy was because someone had always handled the difficult parts. That someone had been me. My mother called me one evening. "Claire, have you heard about the cottage?" I knew immediately what she meant. Yes. Emily is having a hard time managing everything. I stayed quiet, because I knew where this conversation was going. My mother sighed. "I was wondering if you could give her some advice." Advice. That word. It sounded harmless, but I knew what it meant. They wanted me to step back into my old role, the fixer, the problem solver, the person who made everything easier. I asked, "Mom, why doesn't Emily ask for help from the people who made the decision?" Silence. A very long silence. Then my mother said, "Claire, that's not fair." I almost smiled, because for years, nobody had asked whether things were fair for me, but now that I had boundaries, suddenly fairness mattered. "I'm not trying to punish anyone," I said, "I just think Emily should learn how to manage something she wanted." My mother didn't answer, and I knew she understood, because deep down, everyone knew the truth. Emily had received the cottage, but I had been the one who knew how to keep things running. A few weeks later, my business reached another milestone. I signed a contract that allowed me to expand my company. I rented a bigger office. I hired my first employees. I stood inside that office after everyone left and looked around. It wasn't a family inheritance. It wasn't something handed to me. It wasn't a gift. It was something I created, and That meant more than anything my parents could have given me. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from my father. It was short, only one sentence: Claire, we need to talk. I stared at those words because I knew something had changed. My father had never been the one to admit he needed a conversation. He had always been the person who made decisions, the person everyone listened to, but now he was reaching out, and for the first time, I wondered if my family was finally beginning to understand what they had lost. Not a daughter who could help them, not someone who could fix their problems, but a person who had spent years loving them, until she finally learned to love herself. When my father asked me to talk, I didn't answer right away. I stared at his message for several minutes. Claire, we need to talk. 5 simple words, but they carried years of history. The old version of me would have immediately called him back. I would have wondered what he needed. I would have worried whether something was wrong. I would have prepared myself to fix whatever problem had appeared. That was the role I had played my entire life, the daughter who showed up, the daughter who solved problems, the daughter who never made things harder. But I wasn't that person anymore. So I waited, not to punish him, not to make him feel guilty. I waited because I had finally learned that my time mattered too. The next morning, I replied, sure. When would you like to meet? A few hours later, he suggested a restaurant near his office. A place where we had gone many times when I was younger. I almost laughed when I saw the name, because that restaurant held another memory years ago. After I graduated college, my father took me there. I thought he was finally going to tell me how proud he was. Instead, he spent most of dinner talking about Emily's future plans. At the end of the night, he simply said, you'll be fine, Claire. You always are. Back then, I smiled, but inside, those words hurt, because I didn't want to always be fine. Sometimes I wanted someone to notice when I wasn't. When I arrived at the restaurant, my father was already there. He stood up when he saw me. That surprised me. My father had always been a confident man. A businessman, someone who rarely showed uncertainty, but that day, he looked different, older, more tired, almost unsure of himself. Claire, he said, thanks for coming. I nodded. We sat down. For the first few minutes, we talked about ordinary things: work, the weather, the restaurant, anything except the reason we were there. Finally, my father put down his glass. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. Those words were unexpected, not because I didn't want to hear them, but because I had spent so many years believing I never would. I know the cottage situation hurt you, he said. I stayed quiet. I know your mother and I should have talked to you before making that decision. I looked at him. Why didn't you? He took a breath, and for the first time, I saw him struggle to find an answer. We thought. He stopped, then started again. We thought you would understand. There. It was the sentence I had heard my entire life. Claire will understand. Claire will adjust. Claire will be okay. I looked at my father and said, Dad, do you know what hurts the most? He looked at me. It's not that you gave the cottage to Emily. His expression changed. It's that you never thought I deserved a conversation. My father looked down. I never wanted you to feel less important. I nodded slowly, but that's how I felt. The words came out calmly, not angry, not emotional, just honest. I spent years watching everyone celebrate Emily, and every time I felt hurt, I told myself I was being selfish. I paused. I convinced myself that because I was independent, I didn't need anything. My father looked at me, but I did need something. What? I needed to know I mattered. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then my father said something I never expected. I think I made a mistake. Those words were difficult because part of me wanted to hear them years earlier, when I was younger, when I was still trying to earn his attention, but hearing them now felt different. I wasn't the same person anymore. I didn't need an apology to prove I was worthy. I had already proven that to myself. I'm glad you understand now, I said, but I need you to know something. My father looked up. I'm not angry anymore. That surprised him. I thought I would always be angry about this. But I'm not. Then what are you? I thought about the question, different. Because that was the truth. The person sitting across from him was not the daughter who left that dinner feeling rejected. She was someone who had built a life without waiting for permission. A few days after my conversation with my father, Emily called. I almost didn't answer, not because I didn't care, but because I knew our relationship had changed. When I picked up, she sounded nervous. Claire? Hey, Emily. There was a pause, then she said, I heard you talk to Dad. Yes. Another pause. I think I owe you an apology too. I didn't say anything. So she continued, I should have said something when they told me about the cottage. I looked out the window. The city was busy below me, people moving forward with their lives just like I was. You knew before I did. I said, I know. And you didn't think I deserved to know? Her voice became quiet. I guess I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would be upset. I almost smiled, because she had been afraid of my reaction, not of hurting me. There was a difference. I wasn't upset because you got the cottage. I said, I was hurt because everyone decided my feelings didn't matter. Emily was silent, then she said, I never realized how much you did for me. Those words surprised me, because they were the first time my sister acknowledged something my family had ignored for years. You always made everything easier, she said, and I think I got used to it. I didn't forgive everything instantly. That wouldn't have been honest. Years of feeling overlooked don't disappear after one conversation, but something changed for the first time. My family wasn't defending themselves, they were listening, and sometimes being heard is the beginning of healing. A month later, I received an invitation at a family gathering at the cottage. I stared at the message. The same place that started everything, the same place where I had spent my childhood, the same place that had made me question whether I truly belonged. Part of me wanted to refuse, part of me wanted to protect the peace I had built, but another part of me wondered, maybe going back wasn't about them, maybe it was about me, maybe it was time to return to a place I loved. Not as someone fighting for a place in the family, but as someone who already knew her own worth, and I had no idea that when I arrived at that cottage again, I would discover something my family had been hiding from me for years. When I received the invitation to return to the cottage, I didn't know how to feel. For years, that place had represented some of my happiest memories, but after the family dinner, it had also become the symbol of everything that hurt me, the unfairness, the disappointment, the feeling of being the person everyone relied on but nobody truly saw it. I held the invitation in my hands and wondered if going back was a mistake. Maybe some places were better left in the past, maybe some doors were better kept closed. But then I realized something. I wasn't the same person who left that dinner months ago. Back then, I left feeling rejected. Now, I was returning because I chose to, and there was a difference. A big difference. The drive to the cottage took almost 3 hours. The entire way there, memories came back, the old road surrounded by trees, the small town near the lake, the familiar signs along the highway. Everything looked exactly the same, but somehow, everything felt different, because I was different. When I was younger, I used to think that cottage was special because my family owned it. Now I understood something. The memories were special because of the person I was back then, the laughter, the adventures, the feeling of freedom. Those things belonged to me, nobody could take them away, not even my family. When I arrived, everyone was already there. My parents, Emily, her husband, and their children. For a moment, I stood outside the car and watched them. A year earlier, I would have felt like an outsider, like I was walking into someone else's family gathering, but that feeling was gone. I walked toward the house with confidence. My father saw me first. A smile appeared on his face. Claire. There was something different in the way he said my name, not like a reminder, not like someone he needed, like someone he was happy to see. Hi, Dad. He hugged me, and surprisingly, I hugged him back. Not because everything was fixed, not because the past disappeared, but because I was no longer carrying the same anger. Inside the cottage, everything looked familiar, the wooden floors, the old fireplace, the pictures on the walls. I walked slowly through the rooms. I remembered being 12 years old and running through the hallway with Emily. I remembered my father teaching us how to build a fire outside. I remembered my mother calling us inside when it started raining. For years, I thought losing the cottage meant losing those memories. But standing there again, I realized something. Memories don't belong to buildings, they belong to the people who live them. That evening, we sat outside near the lake, the sunset reflected on the water. For the first time in a long time, the conversation felt natural. Not forced, not uncomfortable. My father asked about my company. My mother asked about my employees. Emily asked about my future plans. Simple questions, normal questions, questions they should have asked years ago, but I appreciated them anyway, because sometimes people don't realize what they've missed until they finally start paying attention. Later that night, my father and I walked near the dock, the same dock where I used to sit as a child. He stopped and looked at the water. I used to bring you here when you were little. I smiled. I remember. You always asked 100 questions. I laughed. That sounds like me. He smiled, then his expression became serious. Claire, I've been thinking about something. I waited. The cottage decision. I knew this conversation was coming. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. He looked down, but I realize now that I was only thinking about who needed it most. I didn't say anything, because I wanted him to finish. I didn't think about who had been there all along. That sentence stayed with me, because that was the truth. My family had always measured need, who needed more help, who needed more support, who needed more attention, but they had forgotten something important. Being the person who needs less doesn't mean you deserve less. Strong people still need love. Independent people still want to feel valued. The person who gives the most still wants to know they matter. The next morning, something unexpected happened. I found Emily sitting alone on the porch. She looked worried. Can I talk to you? I nodded. She took a deep breath. I need to tell you something. I waited. The cottage isn't what I thought it would be. I wasn't surprised, but I didn't say anything. She continued, when Mom and Dad gave it to me, I thought it was perfect. She looked toward the lake. I thought it meant I was finally the one they trusted. Those words surprised me, because for the first time, I realized something. Emily had her own insecurities too. She wasn't just the favorite daughter, she was also someone who spent years trying to live up to an image. I was so focused on getting something, she said, I never stopped to think about what you lost. I looked at my sister. That was the apology I had needed, not excuses, not explanations, understanding. I should have spoken up, she said. When they told me about the cottage, I should have said we needed to talk to you. I nodded, yes. You should have. She looked down, I'm sorry. And this time, I believed her, but then she said something else, something I didn't expect. I also realized something after managing this place. What? You were the reason everything always worked. I looked at her, she smiled sadly. You were the one who remembered the repairs. The bills. The schedules. Everything. She shook her head. I thought you were just helping because you liked being responsible. She paused, but now I understand. You were carrying the family. Those words were powerful, because they confirmed something I had always felt. I wasn't invisible because I had done nothing. I was invisible because everyone had become comfortable with everything I did. They noticed the things I stopped doing, before they ever noticed the things I had done. That afternoon, my father called everyone together. There was something he wanted to announce. We all sat in the living room, the same room where my parents had once told me the cottage would go to Emily, but this time, the atmosphere was different. My father looked at me, then at Emily. I made a mistake. Everyone became quiet. I thought giving this cottage to one person would protect the family. He paused, but I forgot that a family is not built by possessions. He looked at me, it's built by how people are treated. Then he revealed something nobody expected. He had changed the arrangement, not because he wanted to take something away from Emily, but because he realized the decision had been unfair. The cottage would no longer represent favoritism. It would become something shared, something discussed together, something that belonged to the whole family. I listened quietly, and I realized something. The cottage wasn't what mattered anymore. A year ago, I would have considered this the victory, the moment when my family finally admitted I was right, but now, I didn't need a piece of property to prove I belonged. I had already built something much more valuable. A life where my worth wasn't decided by someone else's choices. That night, I walked down to the lake alone, the same place where I had once sat as a child dreaming about the future. I looked at the water, and I smiled, because the little girl who once wondered if she mattered, finally knew the answer. She always had, but there was still one final conversation waiting for me, because forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and rebuilding a family meant facing the truth of what had been broken. The next morning, my father asked me to sit with him. And this time, he wasn't talking about the cottage. He was talking about the years we had lost. The next morning, I woke up earlier than everyone else. For a few minutes, I just lay there listening to the quiet sounds of the cottage, the wind moving through the trees, the water touching the shore, the old wooden house making the same familiar sounds it had made for decades. It was strange that a place that had once caused me so much pain was now giving me a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. I got dressed and walked outside. The lake was exactly the same as I remembered, but I wasn't. When I was younger, I thought my family's love was something I had to earn. I believed if I worked harder, helped more, and caused fewer problems, eventually I would become the daughter they were proud of. I thought one day my father would look at me and say, Claire, you were the one we could always count on. I thought those words would heal every disappointment. But I was wrong, because no words from someone else could fix the years I spent believing I wasn't enough. The only person who could truly change that belief was me. My father found me near the dock. He stood beside me quietly for a while. Then he said, I used to think being a good father meant providing for my children. I looked at him. He continued, I thought if I gave you a good home, paid for your education, and made sure you had opportunities, then I had done my job. He looked out at the lake, but I realize now that I missed something important. What? I needed to make you feel seen. Those words were simple, but they carried a lot of weight. For years, my father had focused on what he gave us. The house, the vacations, the opportunities, but he never realized that sometimes children don't remember the things parents buy, they remember the moments parents notice them, the moments they say, I'm proud of you. I believe in you. I'm happy you're here. And those were the things I had spent years waiting for. I'm sorry, Claire, he said. I looked at him. A real apology sounds different. It doesn't explain. It doesn't defend. It doesn't say, I'm sorry you felt that way. It says, I understand what I did. And for the first time, my father truly understood. I should have included you, he said. I should have seen how much you gave to this family. He paused, and I should have never assumed that because you were strong, you didn't need us. I felt tears in my eyes, not because I was finally getting what I wanted, but because I realized something. The apology I had waited for years was finally here, and instead of feeling like a victory, it felt like closure, because I no longer needed it to move forward. I had already moved forward. After we returned from the cottage, my relationship with my family changed, not in some magical way where everything became perfect overnight. That doesn't happen. Trust takes time, especially when it has been damaged for years. But we started building something new, something more honest. My mother began calling me just to talk, not because she needed help, not because there was a problem, just because she wanted to know how I was doing. At first, it felt strange that I would wait for the request. The reason behind the call, but sometimes, there wasn't one. Sometimes she simply wanted to hear my voice, and that meant more than she probably realized. Emily and I also changed. Our relationship became more equal. For years, I had been the responsible sister and she had been the one receiving support. But now we were just two adults. Two women with different lives, different struggles, different strengths. One day, she told me something that stayed with me. She said, "I used to think you were lucky because you didn't need anyone." I laughed. "Is that what you thought?" She nodded. "But now I realize you weren't lucky." She looked at me. "You were just strong because you had to be." That sentence meant a lot, because sometimes people misunderstand strength. They see someone handling everything and assume they don't need help. They see someone standing alone and assume they prefer it that way, but strength is often created because there was no other choice, and strong people deserve support too. A year after that family dinner, I returned to the cottage again. This time, there was no tension. No hidden decisions. No feeling like I was standing outside my own family. Everyone was there. My parents, Emily, the children, and me. We spent the weekend together. We cooked. We laughed. We told old stories, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't fighting for a place. I already had one. At sunset, I walked down to the lake alone. I thought about the little girl who used to sit there dreaming about the future. She thought the cottage was special because it belonged to her family, but now I understood, the cottage was never what made those memories valuable. The love I felt in those moments was real. Even if my family later made mistakes, even if they hurt me, the past could still contain beautiful memories, and healing didn't mean pretending the pain never happened. It meant no longer letting the pain control me. Some people might ask if I was happy when my parents realized their mistake. The answer is yes, but not because they regretted choosing Emily, not because they changed the cottage arrangement, not because they finally saw my success. I was happy because I stopped needing those things. I had already found my own value. Looking back, I realized the cottage was never really the issue. The cottage was just the moment that forced me to see the truth. For years, I had confused being needed with being loved. I thought if I was useful enough, people would choose me. But love is not supposed to be earned through exhaustion. Family is not supposed to be a place where you constantly prove your worth. My parents gave my sister the cottage, and for a while, I thought they had taken something away from me, but they actually gave me something I never had before. The courage to stop chasing approval, the courage to set boundaries, the courage to build a life that belonged to me. Today, I still visit the cottage, sometimes with my family, sometimes alone, and every time I sit by the lake, I remember the person I used to be. The daughter who waited to be chosen, the sister who always stepped aside, the woman who thought she needed permission to matter, and I wish I could go back and tell her one thing: you were never less important. You were never forgotten because you lacked value. You were only waiting for people who didn't know how to see you. In the end, my parents didn't teach me the greatest lesson. My sister didn't teach me the greatest lesson, the cottage didn't teach me the greatest lesson. I taught myself. A person's worth is not measured by what they inherit, not by what they receive, not by whether someone chooses them first. Your worth comes from who you are when nobody is clapping, and that is something nobody can ever take away. Because my family gave my sister a cottage, but I gave myself a life.